Hi, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video. And the topic of this video will be on perfectionism, focus, and the personality dimension of neuroticism. And that can sound like a very interesting topic, and one may wonder how all these things are related to one another. And I have chosen to speak about this topic by way of my own personal experience as being highly perfectionistic and explaining how perfectionism, neuroticism, and focus have a great deal of correlation with one another by way of research and study and my own personal experience. So first, it's to say that the personality trait of neuroticism is one's disposition to experiencing negative emotion or one's disposition in experiencing certain levels of anxiety and distaste towards one's own personal actions, reactions, and choice of actions. So someone who loads high in neuroticism oftentimes feels rather negatively about themselves, and they are rather anxious and self-conscious to a certain extent about their behaviors, and they start with a me first explanation for problems in the world or problems in their lives. They would be the opposite of narcissistic and a others first, or everyone but myself first. Neuroticism says start with self first in terms of blame, and don't look at everyone else until much later. So that's a rough description of what neuroticism is. And the physiological basis for neuroticism isn't well understood, and I haven't read enough literature on the physiological basis for it to incorporate that into this argument. So I will pass over that, and I may return to it at a later time in another video and go into the personality trait of neuroticism in greater depth. But it is to say that I think neuroticism as a personality trait is, one, neuroticism is a universal personality dimension. Everyone loads some way on that trait. And in the Myers-Briggs or the Jungian typology inventory on 16 personality types, one can roughly see this as the dichotomy between assertive or turbulent. And the trait of neuroticism would be that of loading towards the dimension of neuroticism on the positive correlation versus loading towards the dimension of neuroticism on the negative correlation, which would be assertive rather than turbulent. So I would say I'm an individual who loads on neuroticism. Though I don't load high on neuroticism, I load moderately on neuroticism. But it seems that given the perfectionism that I have and the perfectionism in a certain population of people, there have been studies to show that people who have perfectionism are not as obsessive compulsive or don't suffer from obsessive compulsory disorders as previously and popularly thought. That there are dimensions to perfectionism even, and that the symptoms of perfectionism do not necessarily stem from the same etiology or root cause, and that neuroticism is a factor in the trait of perfectionism. And I think that anyone who is perfectionistic can relate to this in noticing that when they do not do a good job, and per se when I do not do a good job at something, I feel highly negative towards myself and my actions. I am very self-judgmental in condemning of of inadequate performances or inadequate results. I will blame myself first before I blame anyone else. And this is a trait, a very key trait in perfectionism. Perfectionistic people, they load in a certain dimension of neuroticism, and it leads me to say that perfectionism is a trait in an aspect of neuroticism. Doesn't mean it completely derives from neuroticism, but there are neurotic tendencies to the trait of perfectionism that makes me say that the two are related to one another and stem from the same source in the individual per se, and it's starting with a me first attitude and being particularly concerned with action and performance. Now, I may be more concerned with action and performance because I live in an American culture or a westernized culture, but it's a concern so far as in that I see whatever I produce as a representation of myself, and I want no representation of myself to be out in the world that I disdain or I feel is inadequate, because that would be an inadequate representation of me. This is neurotic, and this is even a slight form of psychopathy, I think, to some degree, but it is something that exists with me nonetheless, and it's not anything that's going anywhere. It's a negative and positive dimension of my personality that I fully accept and realize is in many adults. And I find, as in reading biographies of eminent individuals and people who are profound, who produce profound results in fields, this is a trait that many of them share. And it's also a trait that many underperforming people share, and people who suffer from great deals of anxiety disorders share. Even people who are schizophrenic or bipolar share. So there seems to be a correlation amongst all these individuals in terms of their levels of neuroticism and perfectionism, essentially their levels of self-judgment towards a negative space rather than a positive space. So you will not find grandiosity in me. You may find grandiose ideas, per se, reaching for grandiose things. And I say grandiose as in, I will consider solving very highbrow issues in mathematics and physics. I have a rational and sober view of what it would take to be able to solve those problems, but I think that I should attempt to solve them, or that it would be interesting to solve them nonetheless. And I think that I classify that as a grandiose view because I come across very really in the normal population that many people do not think or even consider these things. And I think and consider these things because I just find them interesting and mentally stimulating and engaging. And that's primarily what I'm seeking, but I can see very much how people would see that as a form of grandiosity, but as grandiosity in an opposite direction, one away from self and one more towards objective and external things rather than my own self. So you won't find that in me. What you will find is a trait or a collection of neurotic patterns, and I don't mean neurotic as in the Freudian sense of neuroses per se, because I don't think that the pattern even comes there by way of any abuse, though some people would postulate that. No one ever told me to be a perfectionist. Even as a child, I can distinctly remember drawing things in my kindergarten class, and my teacher looking at them and saying, "Oh, Joshua, that's a wonderful drawing, but I'm trying to take and represent what's in reality to the finest detail. I want it completely accurate with the picture I'm looking at. So I was drawing a tiger. It was a Bengal tiger from the cover of this book, and I was drawing it, and it didn't look like the tiger on the book, on the cover of the book. And mind you, I'm about 4 years old, and my teacher says, "That's a wonderful drawing." And I turn to her and I say, "What, are you blind?" Because even as at 4, and no one had told me, like, "Oh, you're a bad boy," or anything like that. No one had said you need to be perfectionistic, you need to try and produce accurate results, or try to produce good results. For some reason, that has been in me innately since I was a child, and if the drawing did not look like reality, I hated it. And I would rip up papers and I would throw them away, and I didn't care. If I didn't understand something per se, I would become extremely frustrated, and I would hate not understanding something. I'm alright with not knowing things now, and I'm okay with not understanding things immediately, and I'm okay with even coming to the understanding that I can't understand it per se, by the way of the magnitude and the scope of the problem and the limitations of me being a human being. But that is after many years of maturation and percolating on certain issues, being able to realize that and accepting that. I'm always okay with not knowing things, and I think there's more that I don't know than what I do know. But I will be sufficiently completely indignant towards anything I can know, not knowing it sufficiently and to the greatest level of perfection I can, and that is perfectionism. Now, where focus, and I think one can draw the correlation, it comes into this picture, is that the scope, it seems like, for the individual who is neurotic and perfectionistic is a very small scope. There are only a collection of items in their world that they are willing to pay attention to in the first place. And I think that this is where focus comes in. I notice this pattern very rarely in the literature that I read on perfectionism, which I find mostly discussed in the gifted community, though I don't think I'm gifted. I find it mostly in the gifted community, and I find it in other et al. Studies in psychology on perfectionism in adults and in children, and in adults and in children in the gifted population, that the individuals in those categories make judgments off of a very about themselves and their orientation to the world from a very small collection of things. So what differs in these people versus the average person, and what maybe the average person can gain from understanding this whenever they're dealing with somebody who is perfectionistic, and they may find that person difficult to deal with, is that they don't, for whatever reason, do not look out into the world or have a collection of things to draw esteem from, or to base their judgments off of in the first place. Their minds seem to be much more narrower in their scope and purview of what's salient to that individual. And what I mean is this, that you can take someone who is perfectionistic, which is, I think, another dimension of neuroticism, and put them in a situation. For example, you can say that take someone who's perfectionistic and say that they need to clean a garage for someone. Okay, let's just say they need to clean a garage for someone, and this is some task that they need to accomplish, and they're working with a group of people to do so. The thing that the perfectionistic person is considering is the job that they're doing, is this goal being met, and what are the people who are asking me to do this job thinking in their appraisal of the work I've done. And that's it. So the scope is so much more smaller, grossly smaller and narrower than the other individuals probably involved in that situation. I find it whenever I go to work, people say, I have this show I want to watch, I have these things I want to do, my family thinks this about me, I love my dog, I have this wonderful relationship. So what if I don't get this thing? So what? Who cares? Because it doesn't matter in the big picture in terms of the homeostasis of the concept of me and how I relate to the world. To where even the perfectionistic person, they can have those things, but because they load a certain way on the dimension of neuroticism, those things, at least in the immediacy of the activity, do not matter whatsoever and are not relevant. You can see that what neuroticism and perfectionism does for an individual in terms of meeting goals at the very least is create a tunnel vision like syndrome, and from the very initial standpoint is derived from a small view or a small orbit of topics and issues that are relevant to that person. So you can find businessmen and sales executives that really what matters to them is they're climbing up the dominance hierarchy and the quota is being met, and that's all really that they're considering. And these people come off as assholes or jerks or rude people. And it's not an excuse for any sort of behavior, because they think it's not as if the corporate world isn't malevolent and completely inhumane in some respects. But I'm noticing more and more that people who are perfectionistic, they only think of a few things and they only hover and dwell around those few things, and they only generate esteem and value from a very narrow collection of things. They are much more introverted in some ways in their focus. It's not to say that people who are extroverts can't be perfectionistic, but I even noticed that people who are extroverted and are perfectionistic, they're such as Steve Jobs, their focus is infinitely more narrower than the average person. They're not considering many other things that people are considering, and I don't think that they're able to. I at least know in myself, I'm not always able to without having the certain transient hypofrontality in the shower where my mind down regulates and I can take a step back and put a bit of a distance between myself and my performances or what I do and what I produce. And I can very strongly see this trend and so many individuals who deal with perfectionism. And I would say that the perfectionist, you should have, no matter how difficult they may be to deal with, have a bit of empathy for that person, because that person does not, for whatever reasons, pay attention nor derive from the same sources that you do their own image and their own esteem. It does not come in their relation to their self, is one of a critical nature to begin with. However severe or however light, it is criticism nonetheless that they start at with themselves in terms of their evaluations and self-appraisals. And it's not to say that they have low self-esteem, because I know I don't have low self-esteem, but I know how I feel about things do not matter in the slightest about me driving myself towards certain results. I do not care, per se, in a way, to preserve myself in any way if it costs me the end goal or the result I've been striving for, because I know I will be far more critical of myself if I do not achieve this thing, more so than I would be if I was laxed or light on myself. It is why I will pass on hanging out with people at times. It is why I will pass on going to the bar. It is why I'll even put off making these videos, though I greatly enjoy dealing with these topics and these arguments and these presentations. It's just that the whatever standards, however these standards got here, because they have been so intense and real from a very early age, whenever and however they got there, they are their own. It is, I am my own master, and I am my own chattel driver, and I am my own judicator and judge and executioner. I have the positive self, and I have very much of the negative self, and they both have their communication with me, and I commune with both of them to a great deal. The executioner in me does not have mercy towards me, and that's to say that I don't have mercy towards myself. I have mercy and empathy towards other people, but I really have no room for mercy and empathy towards myself. And perfectionism, it is linked to the trait of neuroticism. And when you're looking at the perfectionistic person, understand that you're looking at an individual who experiences the world most likely fundamentally different than you do, and it is what is causing them to drive themselves and you to the places that they go, and why you might find such great intensity in the individual. But I know for me, it would be almost a disavowal of self and a complete emotional and psychological suicide for me to stop being as perfectionistic and intense as I am about certain things, because myself would not live with myself, and I would essentially viciously rip myself apart if I did that. I cannot stand for myself to not do the things that, from whatever source that these standards and metrics were derived, in which I think that they're internally consistent by way of introverted thinking. If I don't do these things, the penalty I am held to is too great and too severe that I must say no to other things to preserve some homeostasis, peace, and equanimity in myself, in order for me to look in the mirror. And the only reason the stakes are that high in the game, and this perspective is even there, and I realize I should articulate and voice these things, because I was having this discussion with a coworker today. the only reason, as I was saying, the only reason that they're there is because of the existence, and because of the existence in this relationship I can have with myself, and it's by way of the trait of neuroticism, and I don't particularly get to pick if I want to be neurotic or perfectionistic or not. I very much mitigate and license it and how it shows up, but it's just the perfectionism and intensity. It's not going anywhere, and the only reason it exists is because of the very small scope of attention that I come with in the first place. I have sought to differentiate myself with extroverted intuition and spread myself out more so than I did in the past, and I'm not nearly as monolithic as I once was, but that drive is there nonetheless, and it is a very real one, and one that all people, I think, who deal with perfectionism deals with, because perfectionism is not an obsessive compulsory disorder. It's not like OCD. It's not a ritual, but a drive and a very real metric of self-appraisal that is played over and over again and must be answered to by the individual. And that's why I think that through the research and experience that I think perfectionism, neuroticism, and focus are linked. Because if one focuses on a thing, it means that they're staring at something and focusing something is, for people in a lot of ways, is a sign of affection, attention, love, and interest. So there, if somebody has a small scope of focus, there is a deep set of affection, love, and attention. Obviously attention, but a deep set of love and interest in whatever that narrow scope is, and the derivation of meaning that that person receives from those small collections of things, for whatever reasons, are the prime driver, and this having this self first and critical appraisal approach puts them at an interesting place in respects to these things that they focus on, or this one thing that they focus on, as you find with many geniuses or seminal individuals. The one thing that they focused on and gave all their attention to, it just puts them at in a very interesting place to where they must push and they must whip and they must drive themselves, because there is no other way for them to exist per se in terms of their self-equanimity. And if I don't want to have a self-hate relationship, I have to acknowledge and make the necessary sacrifices to my perfectionistic neurotic nature. So that's my video, and those are my thoughts, and thank you for watching.